Welcome to another episode of ResearchPod. Today we're looking at a notable paper from Google researchers about how computers handle language, specifically how to map one sequence of information to another, like turning an English sentence into a French one.
That's right. The paper is titled Sequence-to-Sequence Learning with Neural Networks. It tackles a fundamental problem. How do you get a computer to take an input of any length and produce an output that might be a completely different length?
So instead of just swapping words one for one, this is about handling the whole flow of a sentence?
Exactly. Most standard computer models require a fixed amount of input. Think of it like a form with exactly 10 boxes to fill in. But human language doesn't work that way. A 5-word question might need a 12-word answer. This research proposes a way to bridge that gap.
What was the standard approach before this paper came along in 2014?
Most systems used what's called phrase-based translation. It was mature technology, but it relied on hand-tuned rules and massive statistical tables to match pieces of one language to another. It worked, but it was a bit like building a house by gluing together thousands of tiny pre-made blocks. You could get a decent result, but the system never really understood what the house was for.
It lacked a big picture understanding, focused on the pieces rather than the whole thought.
Precisely. The researchers wanted to see if a single large mathematical model, a neural network, could learn to do the whole job from start to finish. Read a sentence, understand the core concept, and write that concept in a new language.
So instead of a giant rulebook, they wanted one brain-like structure to handle everything. How do you teach a machine to hold a whole thought?
You build a system that processes things one step at a time, keeping a running summary of what it has seen so far. Imagine reading a book, and after every word, you update a tiny mental note summarizing the story up to that point. By the time you hit the period, that note represents the entire sentence.
So the note is like a compressed code for the whole sentence. But if the sentence is 50 words long, that's a lot to pack into one little note.
That is the exact technical challenge. The system needs to decide what is important to remember and what can be discarded. In this paper, they used an architecture designed to handle these long-range connections. One that can choose to store information for a long time, or erase it if it's just noise.
And this is where the two-part structure of their model comes in?
Yes. Think of it as two separate specialists. The first, called the encoder, reads the English sentence word by word. Its only job is to compress that sentence into a single list of numbers, a kind of thought vector that captures the meaning without using any specific words.
Thought vector, like a coordinate in a giant map of ideas?
That's a good way to put it. The second specialist, the decoder, takes that list of numbers and builds the French sentence from scratch. It never looks at the original English words, only at the thought vector and the French words it has already written.
How does the decoder know when to stop? Couldn't it just keep generating French words forever?
They solve that by teaching the model a special signal, like a stop sign. When the decoder decides the message is complete, it outputs a specific marker. It's really just the model saying, "I'm done."
Elegant. But how does the model actually remember the beginning of a long sentence by the time it reaches the end?
Standard versions of these networks have a short memory. They tend to forget the beginning of a sentence as they process the end. To fix this, they used a setup with internal gates that control the flow of information. These gates are mathematical filters that decide which information stays in memory and which gets erased. The technical name is long short-term memory, or LSTM.
Long short-term, because it's a short-term memory that can actually last a long time if the gates stay open?
Exactly. In this study, they stacked 4 layers of these LSTMs on top of each other. One for the encoder, one for the decoder, allowing the model to capture much more complex patterns in the language.
That sounds like a massive amount of computing power.
It was. Training required 8 high-end graphics chips running for about 10 days. Each layer of the model lived on its own chip. It was a significant infrastructure investment just to learn to translate.
Did all that actually produce better translations than the old phrase-based method?
It did. They used a standard quality metric that compares the machine's output to a human translation. The LSTM system outperformed the mature, hand-tuned, phrase-based systems of the time, and this was a pure approach that learned everything just by looking at examples of English and French sentences with no handcrafted rules at all.
You mentioned there was a counterintuitive trick they used to get those results?
They found the model worked much better if they fed it the English sentences backwards.
Backwards? Like, the cat sat on the mat becomes Matt the on sat cat thee? Why would that help?
Think about the distance between the first word of the English sentence and the first word of the French translation. Normally, the model reads the entire English sentence, stores it in memory, and only then starts writing in French. So the first English word is very far away from the first French word in the model's timeline.
Right. The beginning of the English is separated from the beginning of the French by the entire length of the sentence.
By reversing the English, the last word the model reads, the one freshest in its memory, is now the first word of the original English sentence. So the beginning of the English is right next to the beginning of the French. It's like moving the starting lines of two races so they're side by side.
That's a remarkably simple fix for such a complex memory problem. Did it actually help with long sentences?
Surprisingly, yes. Previous research showed a sharp drop in quality as sentences got longer, but this reversed order approach seemed to stabilize that. The model's memory became much more efficient.
There must be limits, though. The paper mentions a fixed vocabulary. What happens when the model encounters a word it's never seen?
That is one of the main limitations. The model used a set list of the most common words in each language. If it encountered something outside that list, a specific name, a new technical term, it replaced it with a generic placeholder meaning unknown. So if you were translating a story about someone named Zebulon, the model might just call him unknown every time.
And that would drag down the quality score.
It did. Even so, the system was strong enough at handling the rest of the sentence that it still outperformed the traditional systems. It showed that the thought vector approach was quite robust, even with a limited vocabulary.
Did the researchers actually look at these thought vectors? Can you visualize how the computer thinks about a sentence?
They did. They used a technique to flatten the complex, high-dimensional thought vector down into a 2D map. They found that sentences with similar meanings clustered together, Mary loves John and John is loved by Mary, ended up in almost the same spot on the map.
So it recognized that the meaning was the same, even though the word order and grammatical structure were completely different.
Yes, it wasn't matching words, it was capturing the underlying relationship between the subjects. This suggests the model was learning a representation of meaning that is somewhat independent of the specific language used.
If you can turn a sentence into a vector like that, could you do the same for other kinds of information?
That is the real implication. This sequence-to-sequence framework isn't limited to translation. The same logic could map spoken words to written text or a computer program in one language to another. It's a general-purpose way to transform any sequential data, and the paper suggests that by making minimal assumptions about the structure of the input, you get a tool that applies to almost any problem where one sequence leads to another.
So it moved the field away from handcrafting a specific solution for every task.
It was a meaningful step. It proved that deep neural networks could handle the complexity of human language at scale. The architectures have advanced considerably since 2014, but the core idea, encoding a sequence into a compact representation and then decoding it, remains a foundation of the field.
And sometimes the most important insight is a simple one. Reversing the input sentences didn't require more hardware or more data. Just a clearer understanding of where the memory problem actually lived.
Efficiency and logic often matter more than raw power. This research showed that by identifying exactly where the difficulty was in a problem, you can make even complex tasks much more manageable for a machine.
Thanks for walking us through it, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on ResearchPod.
It's always worth examining the mechanics behind the systems we now take for granted.